Let's crack on, because I know that you'll be as keen as I am to hear from some of the experts who we have lined up today. And we've got 3 experts from 3 different vendors, all of whom can help you with some of your security issues. And so I'd like to invite up here, we have Keiron Shepherd, who is the Security Solutions Engineer for F5. Oh, look, we've got some people here in the studio. Fantastic. We've got Filip Verloy, Technical Evangelist for NoName Security. Hello, Filip, as well. And via the power of the interwebs, beaming in directly from the east coast of the United States of America, we have Jim Wachhaus from CyCognito. Hello, Jim. Fantastic. Well, gents, thank you, first of all for participating in this today and for sharing your expertise. It's really appreciated. I want to talk about a few different things. I'm interested from the CISO's point of view, what's really going on out there. And one of the things which we've seen, obviously over the years, has been this great big push for digital transformation. And many companies were already motoring away at that at some speed. But that's really been put on steroids, hasn't it? Accelerated, if you like, by the pandemic. Isn't that right, Filip?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, when you look at companies in general, they do have to keep competing, right? So they do have to keep out-innovating their competitors. Secondly, as you mentioned, people working from home at an accelerated pace, but we also sort of done that unexpectedly to some extent and had to make sure that the security controls, or sometimes the lack of security controls that were put into place, are now sort of being formalized and normalized going forward. So I think, yeah, absolutely lots of work to be done there.
And Keiron, hybrid working as well. It was something which we were all moving towards, but obviously over the last couple of years, everything's changed, hasn't it?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, from the people who provide the applications, you're not just having a cozy data center to provide your workers that are all in the office. As Filip said, they've kind of moved everywhere. So the applications have had to move with them. And then, security can't be an afterthought. So we need to, provide the same levels of security, whether they're at home at Zoom or whether they're in the office.
And Jim, over there on the East Coast, I imagine things are like they are over here. There's this problem of digital sprawl, this lovely phrase about devices and your data. It's no longer all located in one place. Oh, we think Jim might be muted. It wouldn't be a Teams call without an issue like that.
It would not be a Teams call without me having myself muted while you guys were talking. I was going to say the distributed environment is in multiple clouds. It's in some data centers. It is allowing employees who are geographically distributed. Maybe they're on a beach somewhere drinking, umbrella drinks, what have you, trying to get access to their data, your data, appropriately. And the hackers have essentially, 24/7 access to all of these environments and all of these assets. And how we protect them is critically vital. We see it in the news every day.
Yep. So I'm interested in hearing from you guys. We've got a lot of CISOs who will be watching today. What should companies be thinking about when it comes to security? Where do you think are the problem areas which maybe have been overlooked in the past?
Yeah, the thing is not to look at the front door anymore. If we look at some of the recent big attacks, even as recent as a few days ago, we're seeing a lot of evidence of supply chain attacks. So whether they're supply chain in third-party code libraries, we saw the big Log4j vulnerability at Christmas. Recently, October, we're looking at third-party contractors, where it looks like they, as the story unfolds, it seems they may have gained a foothold in that way. It could be third-party accessing your clients through Magikarp-style attacks, but it seems to be, hackers are humans, they'll take the path of least resistance. So, why hammer the front door if they can come around the side?
And you mentioned, for instance, this Okta breach, which the group which is sort of claiming responsibility for that is this group called Lapus. Lapus $. I don't know how you meant to pronounce that. What a nuisance that is. I read somewhere online today, there's a report that they believe the mastermind behind the group is a 16-year-old living just outside Oxford in England.
I did hear that, yeah.
they said living with his mum. It's like, well, he wasn't going to be living on his own, most likely, was it? I mean, it's not that surprising if he's 16 years old. But if someone like that can pull off a stunt like this, then potentially more serious attackers could as well, maybe with more malicious intent.
Yeah, absolutely so. And a lot of those you probably won't hear about, right? So
right.
The thing is, I think, if you look at the possibilities that digital has given us, like, for example, if you think about starting a company today, how easy it is, like they say, any kid in a garage with a laptop can start a company. Same thing goes for malicious attackers, right? So any kid with a laptop sitting at home with his mother can sort of start breaching these applications. And I think one of the reasons is that applications are less and less well understood, right? So they're more and more distributed, to your point. And the idea then becomes, we've had a lot of security controls put into place historically that were sort of meant for a different era almost, or a different way of communication. And it seems that at the moment, these malicious users have figured out or are a step ahead of a lot of large enterprises in terms of really understanding how to secure that landscape.
And Jim, in the past, what companies normally meant by applications might be a website, for instance. But now it's lots of little services, isn't it? And they're all communicating with each other, hundreds of these things, in order to gather information or command it to do something else. And if that communication, if that API messaging isn't secure, then potentially that's something which can be abused.
Absolutely, and microservices are a reality. The environments that they run in are incredibly dynamic. They're developed in near real time, or at least that's the hope of DevSecOps. And identifying where they are for cybersecurity professionals is a real problem. And then communicating the risks is another big problem.
And Filip, I'm imagining the problem with these sort of APIs is that you can't easily sort of slather on security afterwards. You can't get your knife out and put it on like peanut butter and say, okay, we've sorted that out. You've got to do it from the beginning.
Yeah, it's really about understanding the business logic, I think, of those applications that you're putting out there. So just protecting the front door, to Keiron's point, is definitely not a good option here, because the way that the application works is happening in the back end. Like, it could be microservices based, so you don't really know where specific pieces of this functionality are residing. But you have to really understand, how does this application work? And then from a security lens, look into, well, what does that now mean? If I see, these 20 endpoints chatting to each other, and what type of traffic is flowing over these types of systems, then can I understand what that means from a holistic application point of view and apply security controls at that level? That's really the goal.
So who's at fault here? Is it the developers? Are they just uninterested in adding security? Is it a bit of a pain to do that?
I don't think so. I mean, if you think of, ultimately, why are companies doing this? They want to generate business innovation, revenue, new customers. I mean, take 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, if you wanted some money, you went down the high street and went to a bank. Now my bank uses an API to sense my geolocation, and if it's raining, it can put some money in a rainy day pot of money. It's using APIs. It's still a bank. It doesn't do anything extra, but it's doing some clever stuff to try and make it interesting, to keep me sticky as a customer. So the business is driving innovation. That innovation happens to be, APIs are a good technical way to make that innovation happen. And, we have to wrap security around that. Each one of those is a new attack surface vector that we need to cover.
So I'm interested in that process of wrapping security around it. I'm interested in how we incorporate that sooner. Well, what's the way to incentivize that? What's the way to really get companies on board with that?
Yeah, I think from a developer perspective, they indeed want to push out new services as quickly as possible. That's the way they'll keep ahead of the competition. But what we, I think, as a security profession need to provide is a very low path to entry, a very easy way to incorporate security earlier in the development process. So typically called shift left. But the idea is developers are sort of using a specific way to build applications, and you do not want to introduce yet another security tool in their workflow and force them to adopt yet another user interface to essentially build a more secure application. You want to do that almost in an invisible way. So the idea is, can we use some of these shift left approaches and bring security best practices in early without hampering or getting in the way of developers. And that's become a real possibility today. So I think we have to keep pushing on that path.
There's a problem here, isn't there, Jim? Because I used to be a developer, and so I know from personal experience that I was really blooming lazy. And if there was a way of copying someone else's code or using someone else's library to, why reinvent the wheel? We would do that, wouldn't we? We would grab someone else's code. And so much software is actually built on the foundations of other software. And that introduces security issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The supply chain is as true for a company as it is for individual developers that are looking on GitHub or SourceForge for the snippet that's going to get them their application doing exactly what they want it to do from a business point of view, but probably not considering the security ramifications of that. Just look at the Log4j issue. It was a legitimate function to use JDNI in order to do these lookups in a directory, and it got abused. And that was code that existed for, 8 years?
Yeah. It's a big problem. So we're living in a world where it sounds like the beginning of a song, where there's lots of APIs talking to each other, lots of little apps talking to each other. You may have hundreds and hundreds of these things, and you're hoping that those communications are secure, and whoever's built those APIs is doing the proper checking, and there aren't ways around them. But they are attractive to hackers, aren't they? Right. That's somewhere that they're going to focus on. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you think the website is the front door to your business, and that's where you attract and ingress your customers, then the hackers are going to utilize the same, entry point. And if your, communication with another business is an API, or with a mobile device is an API, that's just another door for them to go and tap on and to see how far they can get. They'll, use legitimate techniques. They'll use fuzzing techniques. They'll try to break the business logic, like Filip said, to see how it would work if I try to use the application wrong. But it's just another door for them to use.
Right.
I think it's, to some extent, it's awareness as well, right? So going back to your banking example, we now have directives like open banking, for example. Yes. So people who are, let's say, have adversarial intent, they know that these things are happening. Because sort of traditional banks have to compete with neobanks or fintechs or whatever, so they have to allow this type of communication to exist, and then they sort of think back of, well, if it's a bank using traditional security measures, if we're sort of ahead of the game here, can't we get in through this path, or can't we abuse another angle here? So they're very, very well aware of the possibilities of these sort of more distributed-like attacks.
Do you think attackers are getting more sophisticated in the methods they're using, or are there just more places for them to throw arrows at?
They will always use the path of least resistance, and generally that's the human. If they can, they don't con people because they're stupid, they con people because they're people. If they can get past someone by just, getting someone to give them their password, that's the path of least resistance. If they can walk through an open door like an API or the entrance to a website and break it by doing something simple, they will always try the easiest things first. And obviously if they can move up the level of sophistication because the protection's getting more sophisticated, then they'll have to do that. Some of the mitigation and control techniques we see used with our customers, they're never going to fully protect them, but it's that kind of analogy of, don't outrun the lion, outrun the guy next to you. Make it more difficult, they will move on to someone else.
Right, so you don't necessarily need 100% protection, you just need to be better protected than the other guys.
Exactly.
Because the other guys,
I oftentimes hear CISOs describe it as, I don't want an A in cybersecurity. I want a C+. Because if you're getting an A in cybersecurity, you're probably spending too much on cybersecurity. You're spending too much time on it, right? But a C+ is going to get you ahead of the other guys that are going to get hit.
So what's the typical grade, do we think, of businesses out there? The ones you see. It doesn't have to be your own customers. Of the ones you see who don't buy your solutions, what's the typical grade, do you think?
Well, I think C+ would be generous.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus it varies greatly, I think. like going back to your point of developers being lazy, I think one of the pieces of research that we did a couple of months ago was on banking applications and how secure they are. And one of the things there was a lot of these banks use the same third-party developer to get some of their code into it, which exposed them to all kinds of API-type vulnerabilities. So they might think that they're at a C+ level, but in actual fact, they might be quite behind in reality.
Yeah, and I want to stress, I'm not saying all developers are lazy. I'm saying I was a lazy developer.
Me too.
Yeah, hands up.
No, all developers are lazy. It's okay.
They won't mind. You don't think they're going to tune in and hear about this? I think what is the case is that sometimes there's a lot of pressure on them to deliver by a certain date or a shipping date, and that's when things sometimes can get dropped.
Innovation happens by lazy people trying to use their brains to get out of work, right? So.
Yeah. Okay. So we're all a big fan of lazy then, if it leads to innovation. Okay.
I think so.
So we're seeing all kinds of different types of attacks out there. I mean, at the last BlueFort.Live event, we were talking about ransomware a lot. We talked a little bit about denial of service attacks. I think this sort of API security issue isn't always front and center, is it, of the headlines? It's not as glamorous. And so does that mean that it's more difficult for the CISOs to get these sort of things protected and to get the attention of the board?
Yeah, I think if you sort of look at the direct end result, so let's say the direct end result is ransomware or somebody exfiltrated your data, then the question for the CISO becomes, well, how did they do that? Like, what was the entryway in? Or what were they able to leverage to get that access? Initially, it will be through a human, usually, but they sort of misused some technique to exfiltrate the data or get in, and then ultimately deliver their sort of encryption payload and ransomware your data. So I think it goes back to understanding really what are the entryways into my application, and sort of figuring out that it's a new world out there, right? So it's microservices, it's APIs, it's interconnectedness. And that's where we have to put additional focus.
Would you agree with that, Keiron?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you're right. I think some of it is about what's going to grab the headlines. What's going to get them the biggest slap on the wrist in terms of fines from compliance like GDPR. What's going to affect their brand the most if this gets out in the news? It might be a very technically small hack with not a lot of penetration or data leakage, but commercially it might make them look really bad. And sometimes that's it's who shouts the loudest gets the most money from the board.
So we want security, API security, to be built in more from the beginning of the software development lifecycle. We're all in agreement on that one. Yeah. That feels like a good idea. But of course, it is a cycle. It is a wheel, isn't it? It's something which you can't just do at the beginning and then forget about it. You have to test. And let's talk about that process, Jim.
So you not only have to test it, you have to do that wheel, you have to run that wheel continuously, right? So as your APIs are deployed, you continue looking for new APIs that have been deployed and new connections that have occurred with those APIs, and then testing them for security and continually testing them for security. Because not only is the application itself changing, but the threat actors are changing their tactics. New vulnerabilities are exposed. I like to say Log4j wasn't a problem until it was. And, you have to look back in time then at this application that you trusted that now is not trustworthy because of a new threat actor.
I think it's interesting. I know we touched very briefly upon ransomware, which of course does get the headlines. And what I think maybe, this is I'm supposed to be sharing this, but let me tell you what I wonder is that quite often these days, these threat actors are interested in stealing your data in order to threaten to release it to the world or sell it to others. They may not even care about encrypting your data anymore. It's like if an API call will spit out data about your customers, which other people shouldn't have access to, then that's a real danger. So they may not ever get in to encrypt it, but they can still get stuff out. And that's a That's a real problem, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen on the news many times with open S3 buckets, Amazon storage containers, where there's just unencrypted databases just left there from maybe some old development work, maybe legitimate, but yeah, they don't have to hack anything. They literally knock on the door, get all the data, and say, look what we've got.
So I'd like to go round our virtual table right now and ask each of you where you think the application cyber threat surface is today in 2022 and how you should be defending it. I'm going to start with Filip.
I think where it is today is in a place of misunderstanding, I think, quite a lot. So I think we really have to start by discovery and inventory, understand what we have. So that's going to be a good first step. And then also realize that technology has sort of moved on. There's new ways to build applications. There's new ways to interconnect, and really focus on that avenue in terms of protection. Of course, that's not the be-all and end-all of cybersecurity. I think one of the things that we realize in IT is that the only constant is change, right? So everything keeps on changing. So try to be ahead of that change, but really understand what you have today.
Excellent. Keiron?
Yeah, I think almost twofold. I mean, the front doors are getting stronger and stronger. We've had that protection over the years of building firewalls and web application firewalls. So from the vector, I think, it's going to be more and more supply chain attacks. But the problem, how that manifests itself when that happens is golden inventory. Customers running around like headless chickens going, actually, I don't know what I've got, so I really don't know what's vulnerable. And then that becomes a really key point. Knowing what you actually have running, wherever it may be, becomes really important.
And Jim, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and whatever is running is really wide and far. Looking for those cloud applications that have been ramped up, looking for all of the assets that are internet facing, that are running these third-party utilities or tools. Having that in your inventory is obviously key. And then going a step further, when a breach occurs, having the SBOM, the software bill of materials, to know, actually, I need to talk to these third-party vendors to make sure that they weren't affected by this. And also then downstream from you, if you're a developer, providing that disclosure to your customers to make sure that they know that they might be affected.
Excellent. Well, thank you, all three of you. You're not off the hook yet, because in a moment, I'm going to ask you to take us deep down into some of the solutions and what you're seeing out there, some deeper thoughts as to what you see as being the threats and how to counter some of those.